jamming signals. If God truly communes with us, why don't we recognize his messages? How do we discern the jamming signals that block our reception? Perhaps the reflex answer points to the busyness of the modern times of the 21st century. But have we deluded ourselves in a generational self-centered belief that we operate in a more complex and busy echelon than the people of earlier eras? When considering the relative busyness of our era, I often wonder about the demanding and chaotic lives of our agrarian forefathers. In New England, where I now live, our predecessors plowed through rocky soil to create fields for crops and livestock. These farmers managed their own food production in a region with erratic cycles of weather, without the benefit of radar images and long-range forecasts telling them whether or not to expect a rainy summer or a dry one. They used human and animal strength to move soil and stone to find water underneath the ground, and chopped endless amounts of wood to provide fuel for cooking year-round and heating in the winter. By contrast, we have automation and conveniences that relieve us of many of the manual tasks performed by the generations before us. We drive cars to buy food in a store, flip a switch to get light and power, and gently lift a small handle to extract water. We turn on a TV with a remote control to listen to a professional meteorologist predict the weather, and then heat our homes accordingly by spinning a dial or pressing a button. Certainly, we have to work to earn money to pay for these services. However, given all these advantages, it's difficult for us to allege that busyness distracts us from God in ways not experienced by people in earlier periods of time. One could argue that we have distractions not encountered by our forefathers, such as technology that allows us to connect from anywhere, making it harder to break away from the world for a time of solitude. In addition, many of us experience an ever-increasing volume of noise from man-made machines and other unintended consequences of human innovation that fill our lives with an array of sights and sounds that distract us from our Creator. However, if we challenge this perception with an open mind, we may reveal a truth that the distractions of a busy world began in a much earlier era. In fact, Jesus notes this problem on a number of occasions. In one parable from the Gospel of Luke, he describes a banquet where the A-list is too busy to attend, claiming that they have a new field to tend, an oxen to break in, or other lame excuses. The master reacts by directing his servants to invite strangers. In this parable, the strangers symbolize the Gentiles that God had invited to the table of salvation, while the A-list people epitomize the chosen ones, who missed the coming of the Messiah because they were caught up with the busyness of their world. Jesus concludes the parable with a quote from the Master, "I tell you, not one of these men who were invited will get a taste of my banquet." Luke chapter 14, verse 24. We can have some empathy towards the behavior of the A-list people in this parable. They may have been focused on the responsibility of properly tending and plowing a field in order to ensure an ample supply to feed their families. In several gospel events, Jesus himself demonstrated compassion for those with physical hunger. In one scene, recorded in all three synoptic gospels, Jesus encouraged his disciples to pick grain on the Sabbath in order to feed themselves, knowing this action would precipitate the wrath of the Pharisees, who favored rules over mercy. Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, and Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. Regardless of this consideration, Jesus also knows what lies in the heart of man and recognized that we can become overly focused on our work, caring more about gaining and tending more fields at the expense of higher priorities. The fields can become our obsession, more important than setting aside time to relate to each other, eliminating any time to commune with God, and putting our physical health at risk. In the end, our obsession can render the value of new fields worthless and escalate the urgency of our relationship with God. The Russian author Leo Tolstoy, 1828 through 1910, captured the costly greed for more fields in his short story, How Much Land Does a Man Need? In this story, a generous owner offers to grant ownership of one of his fields to another man. For a fixed price, the owner proposes to the man a golden opportunity to define the size of his new field without any preordained measures of distance. The only constraint is that he has to walk the perimeter of it in a single day, between sunrise and sunset. Whatever distance he can cover in that time will define the boundaries of his field. He must complete his walk, returning to his starting point before sunset, or he gets nothing. I hesitate to give away the ending of a good story, but what would you guess regarding the conclusion? The aspiring owner pushes the boundaries as far as he can, then in the final leg realizes he has underestimated the time required to return, begins running with panic, and collapses in a fatal heart attack just yards from the end. Tolstoy's tale calls attention to the conflict between man and time for the people of the 19th century and for the masses of our own era. For my part, I often find myself trying to stuff 30 hours in a 24-hour day and 8 days' worth of plans in a 7-day week, and I know that I am not alone in this unrealistic approach. I define my fields as the demands and opportunities of my consulting practice, where I can set my own boundaries. Ultimately, I face limits of physical constraints and available resources, and I sometimes fritter away time that could have been saved for important relationships. What are your fields, and how do they crowd your relationships? How many times have we ignored the advice on balancing our lives, as described by the author of Proverbs? Do not wear yourself out to get rich. Have the wisdom to show restraint. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 4. The Gospel of Luke describes an account of Jesus' experience with the busy people of Palestine in the first century. On this occasion, he heals 10 lepers, but only one returns to thank him. The others are too busy enjoying the gift of healing to stop and give thanks. The Gospel records Jesus' astonishment, expressed for the behalf of his audience, because surely he knew what would happen. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Luke chapter 17, verses 17 through 18. Take a moment and try to imagine what on earth could have been more important in that region between Samaria and Galilee than returning to thank Jesus in person. It's easy for us to judge these men in hindsight, but an honest introspection might reveal a similar pattern in our own lives. How often do we fail to give thanks to God? Do we have a track record more like the one who returned to give thanks, or do we resemble the 9 who did not? If so, what holds us back? In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus also encounters 2 sisters with different ideas of how to honor the Lord, Martha and Mary. Martha appears to be the hard-working one. She performs various household chores, while Mary doesn't appear to lift a finger to help. Instead, she sits contentedly at the feet of her Lord, listening to him speak. Martha finally boils over, commanding Jesus, "Tell her to help me." Luke chapter 10, verse 40. In response, Jesus educates Martha on the priorities of the spiritual life and gives us instruction in the dangers of busyness, even when well-intended. You may be an exception to the symptoms of the busy life, but many of the rest of us find ourselves so jammed with daily activities that we have eliminated any potential mind space to recognize what God says to us. His messages may be all around us, in orchestrated events, in the guidance of other people, and in specific instructions to each of us. God directs his signals at us, but we tune ourselves into the world instead of into him. Yet, the good news speaks of hope. We can change that attitude right now, or tomorrow, or whenever we are ready, as long as we do not wait too long. Maybe this upcoming Sunday represents the opportunity of a good day to change. God knew we would be busy, so he commanded us to rest every 7th day. Whether we find ourselves dedicating the week to plowing through earthen fields or plowing through emails on our BlackBerries, we need to set aside the Sabbath to worship, relearn how to listen, and refresh our bodies for the week ahead. This day can serve as the reminder of where to find God on our spiritual dial, but we can also continue to seek him throughout the week. If we commit ourselves, we can learn about God's ability to transcend our busy lives. God can achieve many objectives for us, even if we only allow him in our lives for a moment. In that moment, we might recognize an important invitation, give thanks for our healing, and savor a break from our earthly duties to hear a few words from our Savior.